Iran's nuclear program hits the spotlight again, but in a different, more sinister way. Now, with one of its top scientists killed and another injured, is this nuclear program effectively under attack? Is it Israel or is it the CIA, as Iran claims, and how does Iran respond? Iran, the nuclear program, and a mysterious death within. This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. Whether Iran's nuclear program is for peaceful purposes or not, it needs some pretty impressive brains behind it to make it happen at all. Two of those brains, as it were targeted in twin attacks in Tehran on Monday. One died, the other is injured. What's perhaps more significant, though, is that it's not the first time it's happened, nor is it the only means with which Iran's nuclear scientists have been targeted. Someone clearly wants action taken over Iran's nuclear ambitions. The question is now, who is it and are they succeeding? Our discussion in a moment after this report from Omar Al-Saleh.
Killed in the morning rush hour on the streets of the capital, Tehran. Twin bomb blasts aimed at two of Iran's most senior nuclear minds. Majid Shehriyari was on his way to work when a bomb planted in his car exploded. He died on the spot, his wife injured. Freidoun Abbasi Divani was also targeted in the same way. A bomb in his vehicle exploded. He and his wife survived the blast and are now in hospital. The separate attacks took place between 7 and 8 a.m. Police say assailants on motorcycles attached the bombs to the two cars before they exploded. According to Iranian media, the two targets were professors at Iranian universities. Iran's nuclear chief described Shehriyari as being in charge of what he says was one of the great projects at the country's atomic energy agency. Divani is a specialist in separating isotopes, a process critical in both the civilian and military use of uranium. No one has claimed responsibility, but Iran's president was quick to point a finger of blame.
The terror that has taken place, without any doubts, there are hands of the Western officials and the Israelis, and I hope that the security people of this country will actually find out about it.
Iran has witnessed similar attacks on nuclear scientists in the past. Ardashir Hassanpour, a nuclear scientist working at Iran's uranium conversion plant in Isfahan, died in January 2007. Officials blamed his death on unexplained gas poisoning. In June last year, Shahram Amiri, who worked for Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, disappeared during the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. He surfaced this July claiming he'd been abducted by CIA agents. And in January, Masoud Ali Mohammadi, another leading nuclear expert, was killed when a remote-controlled bomb exploded near his car. The Islamic Republic says it's developing a nuclear program for civilian purposes, but the West maintains it's developing a nuclear weapon. Omar Saleh, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
So let's discuss this now with our guest today in the Iranian capital is Khan Banaderi. He is a journalist, a political analyst. In Brussels for us, Joshua Goodman, Programme Director at the Transatlantic Institute. And rounding out our panel in London is Ian Black. He's the Middle East editor at Britain's Guardian newspaper. Gentlemen, really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on to Inside Story. I'd like to start with actually the same question for each of you. Just a brief answer, if you wouldn't mind, from each of you. And that very simple question is, who did this? Or at least, who is the most likely suspect? Khan Banaderi, let's start with you.
Well, the important question is not to ask who is behind these assassination plots. The question is for us to ask is who is going to benefit from the latest attacks on Iranian nuclear program and its nuclear scientists. Obviously, the answer for Iran has already been clear. It is those who have been trying to put pressure on Iran through different methods and means, such as unilateral international sanctions, the threat of military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. So these are these all point the blaming finger at the United States and its allies, especially Israel. And Iran has every right to suspect that these countries are behind the latest assassination plot against its nuclear program and its nuclear scientists.
Joshua Goodman in Brussels, your view, is it as simple as that, US or its allies?
Well, I think it's, to answer briefly, I think it's a little too early to judge. But I think what's very clear is there's no shortage of internal or external players who have an interest in derailing the Iranian nuclear program, and that has to be bear in mind when we discuss this issue.
Ian Black.
Well, I think President Ahmadinejad probably got it about right when he said that this was likely to be the work of Western governments or Israel. I think they must be the most likely suspects. I don't think an internal suspect is very likely.
Oh, that was actually going to be my next question to you, Ian. Is there any chance, any chance whatsoever of anyone inside Iran? Because I'm sure there's people in Iran who are opposed to the nuclear program or perhaps think it's proving too much of a risk for Iran to carry on.
Well, it's true that in one of the previous killings, I think earlier this year, it was suggested by sources, opposition sources, people around the Green movement, that maybe this was something that was being done by the regime itself in order to intimidate Iranians working on the nuclear program from defecting or from giving information to foreign powers or something like that. It doesn't really make sense. I think that the Iranians almost certainly have ways of protecting their employees in sensitive projects. And I don't think that they would resort to killing them. They are obviously valued people with great expertise and are important to them. So I think it must be that the most likely suspects are those countries, and we know who they are: the United States, the Israelis, the Western European governments, Britain too, who have expressed concern about what the Iranians are doing and have a track record or have the capability or the experience to carry out these sort of clandestine operations.
Okay, so Ian Black talks about track records. They want to expand on that a bit, not just the track record of any people involved, but things that have happened similar to what we've seen with this killing. The US and its allies, they've slapped Iran with sanctions. We know that, trying to discourage nuclear ambitions. But in addition, Iran is convinced they've been involved in several other tactics. Have a quick look at this. Obviously, we've seen the killings, prominent figures in the Iranian nuclear program, shall we say, removed in the most final of ways. There's also perhaps kidnapping to either detract those involved or extract, if you like, information about the program. In July, the Iranian nuclear scientist Shahram Amiri claimed he was kidnapped by US agents for 14 months. And Iran also blames the United States and its allies for the supervirus Stuxnet that affected its nuclear facility earlier in the year. Joshua Goodman in Brussels, let's come to you. These are clearly not coincidences. I think we can say that they're clearly not coincidences. Iran, it has a right to be concerned, I guess, if not a little bit paranoid about not just the sanctions, the broad-based things, but targeted events.
Certainly that's correct. I don't think these are all coincidences, as you pointed out. And Iran has reason to be concerned, in particular, if we accept that the attacks were, the assassinations were the acts of foreign governments or foreign entities. A lot of questions have to be raised about the Iranian security services, about their intelligence agencies, which have allowed now perhaps 3 attacks in the last year within the center of Tehran in the middle of the day, and no one has been caught. It's gone off without a hitch. These have gone off perfectly, and it raises a lot of questions about the ability of the Iranians to just protect their own interests, particularly their nuclear program, which they've staked so much for.
I think that is an excellent point, and I'd like to throw it over to Khan Banadari in Tehran to get a view from Iran. It's a good point that Joshua makes. They're missing these things. The Iranian intelligence service is missing major events like this, which are succeeding.
Well, unfortunately, I have to agree with your distinguished guest. I think the intelligence security services are also to be blamed for the latest problems that happened yesterday. Yes, they haven't taken the issue seriously, despite the fact that last year we had another nuclear scientist assassinated. And I also would like to blame the universities and the academic centers in which these scientists were working as teachers. They did not provide the necessary security and protection for these important and key players in Iran's nuclear nuclear program. Unfortunately, on the other hand, it's a catch-22 for us because Iran is a safe country, so maybe nobody felt the need to provide such protection for these scientists. But from now on, I think they will take extra caution and they will make sure that from now on they will be protecting the important people who are working behind the scenes in Iran's nuclear program.
What does it do to that nuclear program, do you think, Ghanba? I mean, I almost feel you could compare it to the Al-Qaeda situation where people say if you capture Osama bin Laden or kill Osama bin Laden, it probably won't affect the whole organization of Al-Qaeda. If you look at it in the nuclear program, you're targeting very important scientists, but it's going to carry on, isn't it?
Yes, you see, Iran is sick and tired of being pressured and threatened by military strike by the United States and its allies. Iran wants to put an end to this saga of nuclear discussions with the West. That's why Iran is making sure that they know that Iran is sending the right signals that it is willing to talk to the West to resolve the outstanding issues regarding the civilian nature of its program. But unfortunately, the West is not waiting to see any kind of results coming out of these discussions. And now there is another discussion in the town. Now actually everybody's talking about another important motive behind the latest assassinations, which is to discourage Iran from taking part in the next round of nuclear talks with the West, especially 5+1. But Iran has made it clear that it doesn't matter how many people get killed or assassinated, how many scientists are being abducted. Iran is serious about holding talks with the West, and Iran is serious about finding a way out of the current deadlock.
Okay, I'll stop you on that point there because we are going to talk more a little bit later in the show about the P5+1 talks. Ian Black in London, if I come back to you, what we were saying there in the original question was that this probably wouldn't stop the nuclear program. I think that's fair to say. Where it could perhaps succeed is as a deterrent, because if you were studying this sort of stuff in Iran right now, you'd probably be wondering, or at least thinking twice about wanting to join the nuclear program.
I think that's probably right. I mean, obviously, we don't know exactly what happened and who was involved, but I think that you could see how using covert action, assassination, would fit into a framework which says there is this international concern about Iran's nuclear program. Western countries bluntly do not believe what Iran says. They don't believe it's simply a peaceful program. They believe it has a military purpose and potential. And I think that the overall goal is to contain it, to slow it down and to contain it. And I think whether you're talking about covert action or diplomacy, and as we just touched on that, the impending round of P5+1 talks, whether you're talking about covert action or diplomacy, the overall thrust, the overall strategy is to slow down the program, sabotage it, if you like, and to contain it. So I think that everything can be understood if you look at through that prism. You can't stop it. I think we maybe need to talk about this, about, military action has clearly been considered. I would argue that the prospects of military action are receding, and as that happens, we see a different approach with different elements: covert action, assassination, and diplomacy too, directed towards the same end of ensuring that the Iranians find it hard to achieve what other countries believe to be their goal.
Okay then, gentlemen, let's talk about talks, shall we? Because you've mentioned it so far, P5+1, for anyone wondering what that is the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany. Due to begin the next set of talks 5th of December, obviously they want to talk nuclear, but have a listen to the angle that President Ahmadinejad is coming from.
Now today they have come to say we want to hold talks. We say very good. We have always been prepared to negotiate respectfully and with justice. Iran has never given anyone permission and will never give anyone permission to take away the rights of the Iranian nation during the talks and discussions.
And what he also said, President Ahmadinejad, is that the issue of uranium enrichment, which is central to everything to do with the nuclear program, is apparently not up for discussion. So I'll put it to you, Joshua Goodman in Brussels. What's the point? What's the point of going to talks if we can't talk about the elephant in the room?
Well, it's a very good question. If the core issue isn't on the table, then talks really will render no benefit. And if we look back at the course or the path by which we had to travel to get to these talks, Iran promised talks way back in July, and only now are they coming to fruition. It doesn't seem. And from the Western perspective, there's a hope that Iran will be far more serious than it has been in the past, but it doesn't seem like they will be because of the time it took to get to this stage, and more importantly, the fact that they're unwilling to, at least from the statements from the president, unwilling to discuss the core issues. But the president doesn't determine the course of negotiations, and those are in the hands of Dr. Jaili, who also reports to the supreme leader, so we can't take the president's word as being the definitive Iranian position.
Iran aside, I'll stay with you, Joshua, is the P5+1 the right mechanism? Has it ever been the right mechanism? Because you've got essentially 6 nations, if I can use this term, ganging up on Iran. The lines are clearly drawn. It's not going to work.
Well, it is the right mechanism because the issue is being handled by the UN Security Council, and to have the permanent members who hold the majority of the weight in the Security Council and the ever important veto power, they're the ones who have to reach a conclusion. And I think even though it's the P5+1, the talks are now being handled by the EU, who is not obviously a member of the Security Council, but they've appointed another person to be involved in the process. And I mean, there doesn't seem to be many other options as to who can represent the international community's concern, because it's not simply the West, it's the international community that has raised its concern about Iran's nuclear program through the United Nations Security Council. And so it is the only mechanism and the only body that can deal with the issue, and that was the intention of the United Nations Security Council, and that is why the US and other countries referred the issue to the United Nations Security Council.
Khan Bandadri in Tehran, you said earlier, just looking at my scribbled notes here, that Iran does want to talk and that these talks should be given a chance. But you've heard what Josh and I have spoken about there. The president has said uranium enrichment is off the table. You can't talk about the nuclear issue if you're not going to talk about uranium enrichment.
You see, it's not about not talking about the elephant in the room. It's not that. What Iran is actually trying to say to the West is that we have so many other outstanding issues that need to be resolved at the same time, such as the problem in Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, the Persian Gulf, and many other places, and many other issues. So Iran says that if we somehow manage to sort out our differences in other sectors, in other fields, in other areas, and if we build that confidence, that kind of confidence and mutual understanding and respect and trust, then it would be much and far easier for us to talk about the main issue, as you said, the elephant in the room. Then since we trust each other, we can listen to each other more carefully, and somehow we can come out with a more positive and a long-lasting solution to the problem and the standoff. But when we forget about, when we disregard all those other differences that have been going on for the past 3 decades, I'm talking about 3 decades, then it's very difficult for us just sit down at the table and talk about a very important issue, very strategic matter that is not going to go away and be resolved overnight. Iran so says, let's do this together, but step by step.
Mutual respect and trust is the point that Khan Bandadri brings up there. Ian Black over there in London. I'm sounding terribly defeatist about everything in this show, but really there isn't any trust. You touched on it before. There's so much suspicion here. It's suspicion over the nuclear program which drives the wedge here.
Well, you know, we've seen over the last few days, everybody knows the WikiLeaks revelations, American diplomacy across the globe, and we've seen and we've focused on that, my own newspaper, The Guardian, and elsewhere, particularly on mistrust, the very profound mistrust of Iran and concern about its nuclear program in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the Gulf, the Saudis, and its neighbors speaking privately of extreme concern, in an extremely aggressive way, if you like, about Iran. And we've seen the very wide levels of concern and distrust about Iran. We've heard from the guest in Tehran a sense of what the Iranian approach is. There are all sorts of issues between Iran and the West. It's true, but what are those issues? I imagine there's an allusion there to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I expect on past form there is an intention to raise the issue of Israel's unacknowledged nuclear arsenal. These are the sort of issues that have to be got out of the way before Iran will discuss its nuclear ambitions, then clearly the grounds for optimism about the next round of talks are pretty thin. I think we've just seen an illustration of the levels of distrust and the mismatch of expectations about what's likely to be done. And I think what may just come out of it is something at a much lower level of managing this so that it doesn't explode into a crisis. But the idea that there can be some significant and substantive outcome from it, I find pretty hard to believe in the light of everything we know about the general situation and the comments that we've just heard.
And the other thing which doesn't help, I think I'll put this to Joshua Goodman over there in Brussels, the other thing that doesn't help is sanctions. Just touched on it a bit earlier, but they're always in place. The West trying to put more tightened sanctions, target the banks, target people linked to the programs. Arguably, they're not working either, and they don't help with what Ghanba was talking about earlier, the mutual respect and trust.
Perhaps they don't help with the mutual respect and trust, but they weren't. Sanctions were put in place as a result of Iran's lack of cooperation, and I think that's a critical point to remember. That it wasn't the first initial reaction. There was an attempt to negotiate the process, but Iran's refusal to participate in good faith and the failure of those discussions led to rounds of sanctions and has continued to lead to rounds of sanctions. And should these discussions fail in similar fashion, then inevitably there'll be additional sanctions, but they're a necessary component to ensuring that Iran doesn't continue in its nuclear program, because while they may not have stopped the nuclear program, they certainly have had an effect on the government's ability to procure technologies for the nuclear program. And I think, in that regard, in ways that the general public may not see, they have been somewhat successful.
Starting to run down the clock here on Inside Story, so we'll be brief just towards the end here, but I want to read all three of you gentlemen a quote I got from the Haaretz newspaper, an Israeli newspaper, left-leaning to be fair, but still an Israeli newspaper, and they said, quote, "History teaches us that a state striving to acquire nuclear weapons will ultimately do so." Now, to be fair, we're not 100% sure whether Iran has got or is going after nuclear weapons. The doubt does still exist. But it goes back to what Ian Black said earlier, and I might just get your view on this, Ian, that you can slow down, you could try to slow down the program, but ultimately there is an end goal, be it civilian power or a nuclear weapon, and they will probably get there.
I think that's probably correct. I think if the determination is there in the face of sanctions and threats and a sense of siege, a government that is determined enough to do this will succeed. And I think what we're seeing now is an attempt to make it more difficult, to raise the cost to Iran of doing so politically, economically, and in terms perhaps also of people's lives, as we've seen. But I think that it's true that if you're determined enough to do that, you will eventually reach that goal. I don't think there's very much doubt about that.
Ghanba Nadri, do you agree with that? That whatever the West piles on Iran, it will press on, it will find a way?
You see, it's not a matter of building a nuclear bomb. As I told you, Iran wants to find a way out of the current deadlock. And Iran also believes in its right mind that the previous round of negotiations did not fail. It was about a fuel swap. Iran said that we simply want to switch the place of swap, which is going to be Turkey. Iran also signed an initial agreement with Turkey and Brazil and said that I will send my stockpiles of low-enriched uranium to Turkey, and then I will get my high-enriched uranium from there. And that was it. It was an innocent proposal that the West refused to accept because the West doesn't want to include or recognize a role for Brazil or Turkey in this problem. That's the end of it. The negotiation did not fail. It's just the conditions are not being accepted by both sides. That's the end of it. But as for building a nuclear bomb, Iran has made it clear on several occasions. The leader of this country has made it on several occasions very clear that Iran is not after the bomb. It goes against Islamic beliefs and values. And at the same time, the government has a firm belief that nuclear bombs are just a liability. And believe me, Iran doesn't have the time, doesn't have the money, doesn't have the support to go out and hold decades of strategic discussions like the ones that are going on between Russia and America about reducing the nuclear weapons. Right. Iran, first of all, doesn't have it, and second of all, doesn't have that kind of facilities to go that far. Iran is not that strong.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to you all. Very informative, very interesting. In Tehran was Ghanbeh Nadri, in Brussels was Joshua Goodman, and in London, Ian Black. Gentlemen, thank you. And thank you, our viewers, so much for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. You can send us comments and suggestions if you like. Hop on the email insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team, though, it's goodbye for now.